My name is Keisha Wilson. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with words like steady, reasonable, and low maintenance. I work as a project coordinator for a mid sized architecture firm in Seattle. I'm the one who keeps timelines intact, who remembers birthdays, who notices when something small is off before it becomes something big. If you ask my friends to describe me, they'd probably say I'm calm. If you ask my husband, well, he'd say I don't like conflict, and for a long time that was true. I got married after 7 years of dating a man I believed I understood completely. We met in our 20s, grew through career changes, shared apartments, shared grief, shared dreams about the kind of kitchen we'd someday renovate. We weren't dramatic, we weren't volatile, we were stable. Or at least, that's what it looked like from the outside. This isn't a story about cheating. It isn't about screaming matches or broken plates. It isn't even about betrayal in the way people usually mean it. It's about silence, about how silence can start as safety, how can it slowly turn into distance, and how two people can know each other's coffee orders, passwords, and breathing patterns, yet still fail to understand the weight of what goes unspoken. For years, I believed that staying quiet made me mature, choosing not to react made me wise, that absorbing small disappointments was simply the price of long term love. But somewhere between it's not a big deal and I'll let it go, something inside me began to shift. This story isn't about revenge, it isn't about exposing anyone. It's about emotional power, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't beg to be seen. It's about what happens when a woman who has always been underestimated, because she doesn't argue, because she doesn't threaten, because she doesn't storm out, decides that silence is no longer surrender. And the most surprising part? No one noticed the change at first. Not my husband, not our friends, not even me. If you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, if you've ever wondered whether silence protects love or slowly erodes it, then maybe you'll recognize pieces of yourself in what I'm about to share. Tell me something before we go on. Have you ever chosen silence because it felt safer than speaking? Before I was a wife, I was the easy one. That's what Daniel used to say when we first started dating. Not in a cruel way. In fact, he meant it as a compliment. You're not dramatic, he'd tell me. You don't overthink everything. At 27, I wore that label like an award. Easy meant lovable. Easy meant low risk. Easy meant he wouldn't get tired of me. By the time we were 5 years in, our dynamic had settled into something predictable. Daniel was expressive, charismatic, and occasionally impatient. I was measured. I asked questions instead of raising my voice. I waited before responding. I believed that if something bothered me long enough, it would prove itself worthy of discussion. Most things didn't pass that test. To his family, I was so understanding. To our friends, I was the mature one. At work, I was unshakable. What they didn't see was how much mental editing went into maintaining that image. When Daniel interrupted me mid-story at dinner parties, I'd smile and let him finish the punchline I was building toward. When he forgot small promises, picking up dry cleaning, calling when he'd be late, I'd say, "It's okay. I figured you got busy." When he made decisions assuming I'd adjust, booking trips, inviting guests, rearranging plans, I'd rearrange. I wasn't resentful. Not then. I genuinely believed this was a partnership, compromise, flow. But over time, I started noticing something subtle. If Daniel forgot something, it was human. If I forgot something, it was unusual. If he needed space, it was respected. If I withdrew, it was questioned. Somehow, I had become the emotional stabilizer, the shock absorber, the quiet insurance policy against discomfort. I don't think he consciously assigned me that role. It just happened gradually, like furniture settling into dents in the carpet. And because I rarely objected, the shape of our relationship molded itself around my silence. People often misunderstand invisibility. They think it feels like being ignored entirely, but that's not how it works. It feels like being appreciated for what you provide, without anyone asking what it costs you. I was valued, I was trusted, I was relied upon, but I was rarely examined. When we got engaged after 7 years, everyone said finally, like we had reached the obvious conclusion of a well-written script. I smiled in every photo. I meant my vows. I believed in us. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the calm exterior, there was a small, quiet question I never voiced. If I stopped being easy, would I still be loved? I didn't realize then that the answer to that question would shape everything that followed. The first cut didn't look like a wound. It looked like a joke. We were 6 months into our engagement, sitting at a dinner with two other couples, friends who had known Daniel since college. The conversation drifted, as it always did, toward wedding planning, budgets, venues, guest lists, the usual choreography of opinions. One of the wives asked me, "So, Keisha, what's your vision? Big ceremony? Intimate?" I had spent weeks thinking about it. Not obsessively, but carefully. I wanted something warm, intentional, fewer people, more meaning. I opened my mouth to answer. Daniel spoke first. "Oh, she doesn't care about that stuff." He laughed lightly. "As long as there's good food and I show up, she's happy." Everyone chuckled. It wasn't malicious, it wasn't sharp, it was casual. But it was wrong. I felt it immediately. That tiny internal pause. That moment when your body registers something your brain hasn't processed yet. I smiled. I even nodded slightly, as if confirming the narrative, because correcting him in that moment would have required shifting the mood. And I didn't want to be the woman who makes dinner uncomfortable. Later that night, while we were brushing our teeth, I said gently, "I actually do care about some of the details." He looked at me in the mirror, confused. "About what?" "The ceremony size, the tone. I told you I didn't want something huge." He shrugged. "Babe, I was just simplifying. You know how they are. It's not a big deal." There it was, not a big deal. And maybe it wasn't. Except that it was the first time I noticed how easily my preferences could be rewritten in real time, how quickly my voice could be replaced by a more convenient version of me. I told myself it was harmless. He didn't mean to erase me. He was just being social, funny, efficient. But the next time it happened, I remembered that dinner. When he described me to a coworker as super chill about everything. When he told his mother, "Keisha doesn't really mind holidays either way." When he said she's not picky, while ordering food for both of us without asking. Individually, each moment was small. Collectively, they formed a pattern. And what unsettled me most wasn't his behavior, it was mine. Because every time he shows us smile, adjust, clarify later, softly, privately, without urgency. And every time he responded the same way. "You're overthinking. It's not that serious." I didn't mean anything by it. The world didn't shake. No one raised their voice. We still held hands, we still kissed goodnight, but something delicate had shifted. I began noticing how often my silence made things easier, not just for him, but for everyone. And I began asking myself a quieter, more dangerous question. If something hurts only a little, how many times does it have to happen before it matters? That was the first cut. No blood, no drama. Just a thin line I could feel, even if no one else could see it. After that first cut, nothing dramatic changed. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive like a storm, it settles like dust. Daniel didn't suddenly become dismissive. He didn't transform into someone cruel. If anything, he was consistent. Affectionate, responsible, proud to call me his fiancé. But I began to notice how often my perspective entered the room second. When we toured apartments to buy our first home, he'd walk ahead with the realtor, discussing square footage and resale value. I'd trail slightly behind, studying light patterns, imagining where bookshelves would sit. When the realtor asked what I thought, Daniel answered before I could. "She'll like whatever has good natural light." It sounded considerate, thoughtful even, except he didn't know that I cared more about layout than light. At a family barbecue, his aunt asked whether we planned to have children soon. Before I could shape the careful answer I had practiced in my head, Daniel laughed and said, "Keisha's the planner. She'll schedule it when it fits her spreadsheet." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But inside, I felt something tighten. Because I wasn't rigid, I wasn't cold. I just liked stability. But somehow, my practicality had become a caricature, an easy shorthand for who I was. Each time, I told myself the same thing. He doesn't mean harm. He's just speaking quickly. It's easier this way. And I rationalized my quiet as maturity. I believed that correcting him publicly would embarrass him, that interrupting would make me look combative, that asking for space in conversations would shift the energy in a way that felt disproportionate. So instead, I made small adjustments in private. I'd prefer it if you let me answer when people ask me something. He would look genuinely puzzled. "I wasn't stopping you." Technically, he wasn't. He just filled the silence faster than I did. And over time, people stopped directing questions at me altogether. They'd ask him about our plans. They'd confirm decisions with him. They'd assume alignment without checking. I became the supportive nod beside him. Reliable, agreeable, predictable. What disturbed me most wasn't that he spoke over me. It was then that I began anticipating it. At gatherings, I'd shorten my responses, knowing he might interject. I'd defer eye contact with him when questions came. I'd step back half a pace, physically creating room for him to occupy. I was shrinking without being asked to. And because I did it gracefully, no one noticed. There's a specific kind of disrespect that hides inside compliments. She's so low maintenance. She never complains. She's easy. Those words followed me everywhere. They sounded like praise, but slowly I realized something unsettling. The more effortless I made things for him, the less visible my effort became. One evening, after another dinner where he summarized my opinions for me, I sat alone on our balcony. Seattle's air was cool and damp, city lights blinking in the distance. I asked myself a question I hadn't dared articulate before. When did understanding me become optional? Because Daniel loved me. I believe that even now. But love, I was starting to see, can coexist with assumption. An assumption left unchecked quietly reshapes reality. And I had helped shape it every time I chose harmony over correction. Every time I told myself it wasn't worth disrupting the moment. Every time I swallowed a sentence halfway through forming it. Disrespect doesn't always feel like an attack. Sometimes it feels like being gently edited out of your own story. And I was still convincing myself that it was normal. I didn't wake up one morning and decide I had been assigned a role. I realized it gradually, like noticing you've been cast in a play long after rehearsals began. It happened the night we hosted our first dinner as a married couple. The table was set perfectly. Linen napkins, warm lighting, a playlist soft enough not to compete with conversation. Daniel moved easily between guests, refilling glasses, telling stories. I stayed near the kitchen, timing dishes, adjusting details, making sure everything flowed. At one point, I stepped into the dining room and heard Daniel say, "Keisha's amazing at this stuff. She handles all the logistics. I just show up." Everyone laughed. I smiled again. But this time, something inside me didn't. Because it was true, I did handle the logistics. The mortgage payments, the shared calendar, the insurance renewals, the family birthday reminders, the quiet smoothing of tension when his sister felt overlooked. I wasn't just his wife, I was the infrastructure. And infrastructure is only noticed when it fails. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the door clicked shut behind our last guest, Daniel wrapped his arms around me. "You're the reason everything runs so smoothly," he said. It was meant to be loving. But suddenly I heard it differently. Everything runs smoothly because I absorb friction, because I anticipate needs, because I prevent discomfort before it surfaces. And somewhere along the way, I had become the emotional operations manager of our marriage. Reliable, useful, invisible. I started replaying moments in my head. How often had he asked, "What do you need?" without attaching it to a task? How often had he waited for my full answer instead of summarizing it for me? How often had I volunteered to handle something before he even considered it? The uncomfortable truth surfaced quietly. No one had forced this role onto me. I had performed it so well that it stuck, and roles once established become expectation. If I was tired, it was unusual. If I hesitated, it was surprising. If I withdrew, it was concerning. But when he dominated conversations, that was just Daniel being Daniel. I began to see the imbalance not in loud arguments, but in subtle assumptions. He assumed I would adjust. He assumed I would understand. He assumed I would carry. And I had trained him to. The hardest part of that realization wasn't anger. It was a responsibility, because if I had built this dynamic with my silence, then I would have to dismantle it the same way. Not with shouting, not with ultimatums, but with something far more uncomfortable. Withdrawal, not coldness, not cruelty, just absence where there had always been effort. That night, lying beside him in the dark, I stared at the ceiling and felt something shift. Not explosively, but structurally. For the first time, I stopped asking, "Why doesn't he see it?" and started asking, "What would happen if I stopped making it so easy?" I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew one thing clearly. I could no longer pretend the role fit comfortably. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It didn't happen after a harsh comment or a broken promise. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Daniel had a presentation at work that week. Something important. Something he'd been preparing for months. The night before, I stayed up later than I wanted to, helping him refine slides, tightening phrasing, adjusting the pacing of his delivery. I listened to him rehearse twice. I gave notes gently. I made tea when his voice grew tired. The next afternoon, he texted me. "It went amazingly. They loved it." I smiled at my desk, my chest warmed with pride. That evening, he came home energized, still riding the high. He told the story animatedly, how the room reacted, who nodded at which slide. the joke that landed perfectly. I listened carefully. I asked follow-up questions. I celebrated him. Then, almost absent-mindedly, I asked, "Did you end up using the revised opening?" He paused. "Oh, yeah, I did." "That's great," I said. "I think it made the flow stronger." He nodded. "Yeah, maybe. Honestly, I just kind of went with my gut." It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't even intentional. But something in that moment clarified for me with startling precision. I wasn't invisible because he disliked me. I was invisible because my contributions were seamless. If something works perfectly, no one wonders who engineered it. Later that night, he fell asleep quickly. I stayed awake, not angry, not hurt, just aware. I replayed the evening in my mind. The energy, the narrative, the way the success belonged entirely to him, not maliciously, but naturally. And I realized something quietly devastating. I had been living inside the margins of our story, supporting, refining, adjusting, but rarely claiming space within it. For years, I believed love meant not keeping score, not demanding acknowledgement, not competing. But what I was feeling wasn't competition. It was erasure by efficiency. I thought back to the dinner party, the apartment tours, the casual jokes, the subtle summarizing of who I was. And I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. Every time I minimized my need to be heard, I reinforced the idea that hearing me wasn't urgent. The shift that night wasn't loud. It was internal. I stopped asking whether he meant harm. I stopped debating whether I was overreacting. Instead, I asked a different question. If I continue like this for another 10 years, will I recognize myself? The answer came faster than I expected. No, and that frightened me more than any argument could have, because arguments at least acknowledge friction. This was smoother than conflict, quieter, more polite, and far more dangerous. I didn't confront him the next morning. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw affection. But something subtle recalibrated inside me. I began to observe, not emotionally but analytically. I noticed how often I anticipated his needs before he voiced them, how quickly I filled gaps, how reflexively I softened my own opinions to keep momentum. And for the first time in 7 years, I considered the possibility that my silence wasn't kindness. It was conditioning. That Tuesday didn't break our marriage. It revealed its structure. And once you see the beams holding something up, you can't unsee them. The next time Daniel interrupted me, I didn't correct him. But I also didn't rescue the conversation. We were at brunch with friends. Someone asked how married life was treating us. I began answering, something light about adjusting to shared routines. Halfway through, Daniel jumped in. "It's basically the same. We've been together forever. Nothing really changes." Normally, I would have smiled and elaborated, added warmth, balanced the statement so it didn't sound flat. This time, I didn't. I took a sip of my coffee, and I let the sentence stand on its own. There was a small pause at the table, just half a second. The kind of pause people fill instinctively. Daniel glanced at me, almost expecting me to expand. I didn't. The conversation moved on. It was subtle. No one would have called it significant. But inside, something felt steadier. For years, my silence had been reactive. It was about avoiding friction, protecting harmony, minimizing disruption. Now it was deliberate. I stopped reminding him about minor things he forgot, unless they affected me directly. I stopped anticipating scheduling conflicts before they appeared. I stopped clarifying my position after he summarized it incorrectly, not as punishment, as data. I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't automatically stabilize everything. At first, nothing seemed different. He still spoke confidently, still assumed alignment, still moved through decisions as though we were synchronized. But small cracks began appearing: a missed bill payment, a double-booked weekend, an awkward moment when someone asked me a direct question and he hesitated, realizing he didn't actually know my answer. Each time I stayed calm, not cold, not distant, just observant. One evening he asked, "You've been quieter lately. Is everything okay?" There it was, the word again. Quieter. As if I hadn't always been quiet. As if the difference wasn't in my volume, but in my participation. "I'm fine," I said evenly, "just thinking more." He studied me for a second, then nodded. "Okay." If this had happened a year earlier, I would have reassured him, explained myself, smoothed the space between us. Now I allowed the space to exist. Silence, I was learning, is uncomfortable only when someone expects you to fill it, and Daniel expected me to. What surprised me most wasn't his reaction. It was mine. I didn't feel vindictive. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear about how much emotional labor I had been performing invisibly, clear about how quickly that labor had been accepted as baseline. When you stop overfunctioning, people don't accuse you of doing less. They simply noticed the absence of excess. And in that absence, reality becomes visible. I wasn't testing him. I wasn't setting traps. I was recalibrating my own behavior to something more honest. If he spoke over me, I let him. And I let the conversation reflect that imbalance. If he forgot something important to me, I didn't quietly fix it. I addressed it directly, or allowed the consequence to surface naturally. For the first time, my silence wasn't about shrinking. It was about refusing to expand beyond what was reciprocated. And that difference changed everything. He didn't know it yet. But the dynamic was shifting, not because I raised my voice, because I stopped cushioning his. When people think of preparation, they imagine visible action. Meetings, confrontations, plans scribbled dramatically across whiteboards. Mine looked like routine. I didn't announce that I was recalibrating my life. I didn't threaten separation. I didn't even change my tone. I simply began documenting. I've always carried a leather-bound planner. Structured columns, neat handwriting, color-coded tabs. Before, it held grocery lists, deadlines, birthdays, and investment reminders. Now it held patterns. Not petty grievances, not emotional diary entries. Patterns? How often have I initiated difficult conversations? How often did he interrupt? How often did he make decisions assuming compliance? How often he asked what I thought and waited? I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was collecting clarity. There's something powerful about seeing repetition in ink. What feels isolated becomes undeniable when it spans pages. But preparation wasn't only emotional, it was structural. I reviewed our finances carefully. Not suspiciously, transparently. We had joint accounts, shared savings, and shared investments. I already managed most of it. That had always been my thing. Now I deepened my understanding. I rebalanced allocations, ensured documentation was clean, verified that my individual credit history stood strong on its own, not because I planned to leave, because I realized I had built stability around us, but not independently within myself. At work, I accepted a leadership training program I had previously declined. It meant longer hours temporarily, more visibility, more authority. Daniel encouraged it casually. Of course you should. You're great at that stuff. He didn't notice the difference in my posture when I said yes this time. Preparation also meant observing his reactions when I stopped overcompensating. When he forgot to RSVP to an event and we arrived uncertain, I didn't smooth the awkwardness. I stood beside him calmly while he explained. When he scheduled something without asking me first, I responded, "I'm not available then," instead of rearranging my plans. He blinked sometimes, surprised but not offended. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a correction without commentary. And here's what no one tells you about quiet shifts. The world doesn't resist them loudly. It adjusts. Friends began directing questions to me more often, not because I demanded it, but because I paused long enough to answer fully. At work, colleagues responded differently when I didn't soften my directives with unnecessary apologies. Even my own body felt different, straighter, less tense in rooms where I once anticipated interruption. Daniel noticed something, but he couldn't name it. "You seem more intense lately," he said one night, not accusing, just curious. "More focused," I replied. He nodded slowly. The truth was simpler. I had stopped protecting him from the natural consequences of imbalance, not in cruel ways, in honest ones. If he dominated a conversation, I didn't rescue it with warmth. I let it feel lopsided. If he overlooked my preference, I didn't minimize it. I repeated it once, clearly, and stopped negotiating with myself internally. Preparation isn't loud. It's incremental. It's strengthening muscles you've rarely used because you were busy carrying someone else's weight. And the most unexpected part? The more I withdrew excess effort, the less exhausted I felt. I had mistaken overextension for love, but love without visibility eventually becomes depleted. There was no master plan forming yet, no secret lawyer consultations, no dramatic exit strategy, just alignment. With my finances, with my career, with my voice, I wasn't moving toward revenge. I was moving toward autonomy. And autonomy, when built quietly, doesn't announce itself. It simply waits for the moment it's needed. Daniel still believed everything was fine. In many ways, it was. We still laughed, still shared meals, still slept in the same bed. But beneath the surface, something had changed fundamentally. For the first time in our relationship, I wasn't preparing us. I was preparing myself. And that difference would matter more than either of us understood. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no discovery of hidden messages, no financial betrayal, no secret life. The revelation was quieter than that. It came on a Sunday afternoon while Daniel was out running errands. I was sitting at our dining table, sunlight cutting across the wood in soft diagonal lines. My planner was open in front of me, not to a specific day, but to the pages I had been filling over the past few months. Patterns, interruptions, assumptions, emotional labor, my adjustments. I flipped through these pages slowly, and for the first time, I didn't read them as isolated observations. I read them as a contract I had never signed, but had been honoring anyway. The private reveal wasn't about what he had done. It was about what I had allowed. I had mistaken harmony for health. I had believed that because we rarely fought, we were thriving. But what we had built was efficiency. He spoke quickly. I adapted. He decided confidently. I adjusted. He forgot. I remembered. He assumed. I clarified later. No explosions, no dramatic breakdowns, just a slow erosion of mutuality. And here's what struck me hardest. Daniel didn't see the imbalance because the system worked. For him, our life ran smoothly. Our home functioned seamlessly. Our social circle admired our stability. Why would he question a structure that never visibly failed? The reveal crystallized in a single, uncomfortable sentence inside my mind. If I continue absorbing the asymmetry, he will never experience it. And if he never experiences it, he will never understand it. That realization wasn't bitter. It was clarifying. For months, I had been withdrawing excess effort, not to punish, but to observe. Now I saw the full picture. When I stopped anticipating everything, small disruptions surfaced. He grew mildly flustered at times, slightly inconvenienced, but never confronted with the emotional weight I had been carrying. Because inconvenience is not the same as invisibility, I closed my planner and sat very still. The leverage I had been preparing wasn't financial. It wasn't legal. It was structural awareness. I understood exactly how much I contributed, not just in tasks, but in emotional calibration. I knew how much of our peace depended on my restraint. And for the first time, I realized something powerful. Peace that relies on one person's silence isn't peace. It's an imbalance disguised as maturity. The private reveal was this. I had more influence over the shape of our marriage than I ever acknowledged. Not because I controlled him, but because I controlled the atmosphere. I controlled when tension escalated or dissolved, when misunderstandings were corrected or absorbed, when my needs were voiced or postponed indefinitely. And I had been choosing postponement. That Sunday, I asked myself a question that felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. If I stopped cushioning everything completely, if I allowed the imbalance to fully reveal itself, would our marriage survive it? It wasn't a threat. It was an experiment I hadn't yet run. I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I felt calm, calmer than I had been in months. Because clarity removes confusion, even when it introduces risk. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew this. I would no longer participate in my own diminishment. Not loudly, not angrily, but completely. And once you decide that internally, the rest becomes a matter of timing. Daniel came home an hour later, cheerful, carrying groceries. "Hey," he called, "you won't believe the line at the store." I looked at him differently, not with resentment, but with precision. I smiled. "Tell me about it." But something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't trying to keep everything smooth anymore. I was waiting to see what happened when it wasn't. Clarity is quiet, but decisions are not. They don't require shouting, but they demand direction. After that Sunday afternoon, I stopped hovering in analysis. Observation had given me awareness. Awareness now requires choice. I had three options. The first was the easiest: return to how things were, resume cushioning, resume anticipating, resume smoothing every imbalance before it becomes visible. It would restore comfort quickly. Daniel would relax, our rhythm would stabilize, and I would slowly disappear again. The second option was confrontation, a long emotional conversation outlining every pattern, every interruption, every assumption. I could present months of observations, articulate the structural imbalance, and ask him to meet me halfway. But I knew something about Daniel. He responds to lived experience more than theory. If I handed him an analysis without consequence, he would listen. He would apologize. He would promise an adjustment. And then slowly, instinct would take over again, because habits embedded over the years don't dissolve through explanation alone. The third option was irreversible, not divorce, not separation, something quieter and far more permanent. I could stop compensating entirely. Not partially, not experimentally, completely. No pre-correction, no anticipatory adjustments, no emotional buffering. If he interrupted me, I would let silence fall heavily. If he assumed my opinion, I would state it once and refuse to repackage it gently. If he forgot something that mattered to me, I would not minimize the disappointment. And most importantly, if our peace depended on my constant regulation, I would let that truth surface fully. The risk was obvious. When you remove invisible support beams, structures either rebalance or crack. There would be discomfort, misalignment, possibly conflict. But the alternative was quieter erosion. One night, lying beside him, I listened to his steady breathing and realized something profound. I didn't want to leave him. I wanted to meet him, fully, as an equal presence. But equality cannot exist where one person is constantly absorbing asymmetry. The decision wasn't about punishing him. It was about refusing to distort myself to maintain equilibrium. The next morning, the opportunity came sooner than I expected. We were discussing a vacation his friends were planning. He spoke confidently about dates and locations. "I'll confirm we're in," it said, already reaching for his phone. "I'm not available that weekend," I replied evenly. He paused mid-text. "Why?" "I committed to a leadership workshop months ago." He frowned slightly. "You didn't mention that." "I did," I said calmly, "a few times." There was no edge in my voice, just a fact. He hesitated. For once, he didn't immediately move forward with his plan. Instead, he put his phone down. "Okay," he said slowly, "then we're not in." It was a small moment, but it felt like tectonic movement, not because he yielded, because he recalculated, and I didn't rush to soften it. That was the irreversible choice. I would no longer edit myself for efficiency. I would let the full shape of me exist, even when it disrupted flow. Because if our marriage couldn't hold my full presence, then it was already weaker than it appeared. I wasn't threatening to leave. I was threatening the illusion. And illusions, once challenged, rarely survive unchanged. Once I made the decision, I didn't announce it. I moved quietly. Not secretly, not deceitfully. Deliberately. The first shift was practical. I separated a portion of my income into an individual savings account. Not hidden, just autonomous. It wasn't about preparing to leave. It was about preparing to stand independently if I ever needed to. For years, I had managed our joint finances with precision. Now, I ensured my personal financial footing was equally solid. I reviewed our insurance policies, updated beneficiaries where appropriate, clarified legal documentation. Not dramatically, just responsibly. Everything transparent, everything lawful, everything calm. If Daniel had asked, I would have told him exactly what I was doing. He didn't ask. At work, I leaned further into visibility. I spoke fully in meetings without cushioning statements with qualifiers like just or maybe. I allowed pauses after my opinions instead of rushing to fill them. The effect was immediate. People listened longer. They didn't interrupt as often. It wasn't because I changed the volume. It was because I stopped signaling that interruption was welcome. At home, the changes were more subtle, but more powerful. When Daniel began summarizing my thoughts for others, I would say lightly, "Actually, that's not quite what I meant," and continue speaking. No tension, no apology. If he forgot to communicate a schedule change, I didn't quietly rearrange my commitments. I kept them. "I won't be home for dinner then," I would say calmly. He began checking with me more often. Not defensively, cautiously. There were small moments of friction. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just longer silences between sentences. He would start to speak, then pause, as if recalculating whether he was about to assume something. That pause told me everything. When you remove invisible labor, people feel its absence, not as an accusation, as an adjustment. One evening, after a slightly awkward exchange at dinner with friends, where I corrected him mid-summary and continued my story without smiling it away, he looked at me in the car and said quietly, "You've changed." I didn't rush to deny it. "I've grown," I said. He absorbed that. For the first time, he didn't counter with humor. He didn't minimize. He didn't say I was overthinking. He simply drove in silence. And that silence was different. Not empty, not hostile, reflective. That's when I understood something critical. Moving in silence isn't about cold withdrawal. It's about consistency without overcompensation. I wasn't escalating conflict. I refused to dissolve it prematurely. And in doing so, I was allowing Daniel to finally experience the full weight of imbalance, without me cushioning the impact. There were no lawyers involved, no ultimatums issued, but the structural shift was undeniable. For the first time in our marriage, the emotional climate wasn't fully regulated by me. It was shared or it destabilized, and Daniel was beginning to feel the difference. He didn't yet understand the depth of it, but he sensed it. Because when the person who has always held everything steady stops overextending, the entire atmosphere changes. Quietly, the consequences didn't arrive with an accusation. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. Daniel double-checked plans more often. He asked follow-up questions he'd never needed to ask before. Are you sure that date works for you? Did I already tell you about this? What do you think? The last question lingered differently now. Not rhetorical, real. But alongside that shift came something else discomfort. One Saturday, we hosted friends again. Same dining table, same warm lighting, same playlist humming softly in the background. Midway through dinner, someone asked about our future plans, career moves, maybe relocating someday. Daniel started answering confidently, sketching out possibilities. Usually, I would nod along, smoothing details afterward. This time, I let him finish. Then I said calmly, "That's one possibility. I'm not sure I want to leave Seattle, though." The table went quiet, not dramatically, just a half second too long. Daniel turned toward me, surprised. "You said you'd consider it." "I said I'd discuss it," I corrected gently. No edge, no embarrassment. Just clarity. The conversation recovered quickly. Someone changed the subject. Laughter returned, but something had shifted in the room. For the first time, people saw that we weren't a single voice. We were two. Later that night, after everyone left, Daniel moved more slowly around the kitchen. Quieter. "You could have told me you felt that strongly," he said finally. "I have," I replied, maybe not as directly. He didn't argue. He just stood there, absorbing it. That was the first visible consequence. He was experiencing misalignment in real time, without me cushioning it in advance. And misalignment feels unsettling when you're used to seamless agreement. Over the next few weeks, small things accumulated. He forgot to confirm travel details, and we had to adjust at the last minute. Normally, I would have anticipated that oversight. He assumed I'd handle a family obligation. I calmly said, "You can coordinate that." He looked startled, not offended, just unfamiliar with the boundary. There was no shouting, but there was friction, not the kind that burns, the kind that makes you aware of surfaces rubbing together for the first time. I could see it in his posture, the slight furrow in his brow. There were longer pauses before he spoke. He wasn't angry, he was unsettled, because something he had relied on, without realizing he relied on it, was no longer automatic. And here's what's important. I wasn't punishing him. I still cared, I still showed up, I still loved him. But I no longer preemptively neutralized every imbalance. Consequences aren't always dramatic losses. Sometimes they're realizations. And Daniel was beginning to realize that our harmony had been engineered, not effortlessly created. One evening, he said something that confirmed it. "It feels like I'm walking on eggshells lately." I met his eyes calmly. "I've been walking carefully for years," I said. Not accusing, not emotional, just honest. He didn't respond immediately, because for the first time, he could feel what asymmetry feels like. And once you feel it, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. Awareness changes tone before it changes behavior. After that conversation, "I've been walking carefully for years," Daniel became noticeably more attentive. He paused before interrupting. He asked, "Do you want to finish?" He double-checked plans. He even thanked me, explicitly, for things he used to assume. On the surface, it looked like progress, and part of me appreciated it. But something deeper felt delayed, not insincere, late. The difference between prevention and repair is timing. For years, I had been signaling softly, clarifying privately, adjusting quietly. Those moments were invitations to recalibrate when the imbalance was still small. Now, recalibration required more than politeness. It required restructuring instinct. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. No phones, no distractions. "I didn't realize," he said. "I didn't know you felt invisible." I studied his face carefully. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't dismissive. He looked genuinely unsettled. "I didn't use that word," I replied gently. He swallowed. "But that's what you mean, right?" The silence stretched between us. For once, I didn't fill it. Finally, I said, "I mean that I've been adjusting in ways you never had to." He leaned back, rubbing his hands together. "Why didn't you just say something sooner?" There it was. The question always sounds reasonable, and yet it carries an unspoken assumption that silence equals consent. "I did," I said calmly, just not loudly. He closed his eyes briefly, processing. "I would have changed." "I know," I said, and I meant it. That was the painful truth. I believe he would have tried. But change offered after someone has already reshaped themselves feels different than change offered during shaping. It feels reactive instead of relational. Over the next few weeks, he made visible efforts. He encouraged me to speak first in group settings. He deferred decisions intentionally. He asked for my opinion and waited. But now I could feel the mechanics of it. It wasn't organic yet. It was a correction. And correction, while admirable, carries weight. One night, lying in bed, he reached for my hand. "Are we okay?" he asked quietly. I paused. For years, my instinct would have been immediate reassurance. "Yes, of course." This time I chose precision. We're aware, I said. He exhaled slowly. Awareness is uncomfortable because it removes illusion. Before, he believed our harmony was natural, effortless. Now he saw the scaffolding. And once you see scaffolding, you can't pretend the structure stands alone. The hardest part wasn't anger, it was a distance. Not physical distance, emotional recalibration. Because when you spend years cushioning an imbalance, you build resilience, but you also build solitude. And solitude, once discovered, doesn't disappear just because someone finally notices it. Daniel was trying, but part of me had already stepped into autonomy, not to leave, but to survive fully. And once a woman stops shrinking internally, you can't simply ask her to fold back into a smaller space. It wasn't too late for effort, but it might have been too late for innocence. The version of me who believed silence was harmless. She was gone. The confrontation didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no slammed doors, no list of accusations unfolded across the table. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening. Rain pressed softly against the windows, Seattle doing what Seattle does best. Daniel had turned off the television earlier than usual. He sat across from me at the dining table. No performance, no distractions. I don't want to keep guessing, he said. Tell me what this is. Not defensive, not wounded, just tired of uncertainty. For a moment, I considered softening it, translating my thoughts into something easier to digest. But that would have been the old pattern, so I spoke plainly. For a long time, I said, I made our life easier by making myself smaller. He flinched slightly, not because I attacked him, but because the sentence landed heavily. I never asked you to do that, he replied. I know, I said. That's part of the problem. Silence settled between us, but it wasn't hostile. It was focused. You didn't ask, I continued, and I didn't tell you clearly enough. So we built something efficient, not equal. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. I thought we were equal. I think we were stable, I corrected gently. Stability isn't the same as mutuality. That word lingered. Mutuality. He repeated it quietly, as if testing how it felt in his mouth. So what happens now? He asked. This was the point where, in another version of me, I would have reassured him. Promised we'd fix it together. Softened the edges so he didn't feel cornered. Instead, I answered honestly. Now, I said, we see whether we can build something that doesn't depend on me overfunctioning. No accusation, no drama, just a clear framework. He looked at me for the long time. Not with anger, with recalibration. I don't want you to shrink, he said quietly. I won't, I replied. The firmness in my voice surprised even me. Not sharp, just settled. And I don't want to feel like I'm failing all the time, he added. You're not failing, I said. You're adjusting to reality. That was the confrontation. Not explosive, not theatrical. Two adults acknowledging that what worked smoothly wasn't necessarily healthy. We talked for hours, not rehashing every incident, but discussing patterns, how quickly he moved in conversations, how instinctively I adapted, how both of us mistook silence for agreement. There were no tears, no ultimatums, just clarity. And clarity, when delivered without heat, forces presence. At one point, he said something that shifted the tone entirely. I didn't realize how much you were holding. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't self-defense. It was recognition. And recognition, when it finally arrives, changes posture. I didn't forgive him for something he didn't intentionally do. I didn't blame him for something I had participated in. We simply acknowledged the imbalance, without drama, without villainizing. The confrontation wasn't about winning. It was about removing distortion. And when the distortion cleared, we were left sitting across from each other. Not as roles, not as infrastructure and beneficiary, but as two people deciding whether they were willing to rebuild consciously. I used to believe strength was endurance, that if I could absorb enough, smooth enough, anticipate enough, love would remain intact. Now I understand something different. Strength is presence, not a loud presence, not a dominating presence, just full presence. Daniel and I are still married. That might surprise people who expect stories like this to end in departure. But this was never about escape. It was about alignment. The months after our confrontation weren't magically smooth. Awareness is heavy at first. You notice every interruption, every assumption, every old reflex is trying to reassert itself. There were moments when he slipped into old patterns. There were moments when I almost slipped into old cushioning. But now we both recognize them. And recognition changes behavior faster than accusation ever could. I speak fully now. If someone asks me a question, I answer without scanning Daniel's face first. If he summarizes my thoughts incorrectly, I correct him lightly and continue. If I don't agree, I say so, calmly, directly, without apology. The most surprising shift wasn't in him. It was in me. I no longer feel the internal pressure to maintain harmony at any cost. If tension arises, I let it exist long enough to be examined. Silence is still part of our marriage, but it's no longer avoidance. It's processing. Daniel asks different questions now. What do you want? Did I assume something there? Tell me if I'm doing it again. He doesn't ask with fear. He asks with awareness, and I answer without minimizing. We didn't become a perfect couple. We became conscious. That's less glamorous, but far more stable. I've also changed outside our marriage. At work, I lead meetings without over-explaining my authority. With friends, I don't rush to mediate every disagreement. With family, I state boundaries once, clearly, and trust them to hold. I used to think quiet dominance meant staying composed no matter what. Now I understand it differently. Quiet dominance is the refusal to abandon yourself in order to keep the room comfortable. It's a calm correction, steady posture, unapologetic clarity. I'm still measured, still thoughtful, still calm, but I'm no longer easy in the way I once was. I'm present, and presence has weight. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this. Silence is powerful, but only when it's chosen, not when it's required for love to survive. I didn't lose my marriage. I lost the version of myself that believed shrinking was maturity. And I don't miss her. When I look back at the early years of our relationship, I don't see villains. I see two people building something, the only way they knew how. Daniel moved quickly through the world, confident, expressive, and forward. I moved carefully, measured, adaptive, stabilizing. Individually, those traits weren't flaws. Together, without awareness, they created an imbalance. And an imbalance doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like efficiency, like smoothness, like we never fight. But harmony built on one person's constant adjustment is fragile. The lesson wasn't that silence is bad. Silence can protect. It can de-escalate. It can create space for thought. The lesson was this. Silence becomes dangerous when it replaces self-expression. For years, I believed love meant absorbing small discomforts so they wouldn't grow into larger conflicts. What I learned is that unspoken patterns don't disappear. They compound. They settle into habits. And habits become identity if you're not careful. The most powerful shift in my marriage didn't come from shouting. It didn't come from ultimatums. It didn't come from leaving. It came from refusing to overfunction, from allowing imbalance to be felt, not angrily, but honestly, and from choosing presence over peacekeeping. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself as the easy one, ask yourself gently, are you easy because you're secure, or because you've trained yourself not to disrupt? There's no shame in being calm. There's no weakness in being measured. But love should expand you, not require you to fold. Silence can be powerful, but only when it's a tool you hold, not a space you're confined to. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever realized that your quiet wasn't maturity, but self-erasure? And what happened when you decided to take up space again?